His eyes match the tie he just shoved in his pocket. Chartreuse. He's handsome, but there's something about him that makes me think he wishes he weren't. Almost as if his looks might be an inconvenience to him. A part of him he doesn't want anyone to notice. He wants to be invisible in the city, just like me. Ugh, Lord, what have I gotten myself into? Does Colleen Hoover think her readers are stupid, or is there actually something else going on? That's the question we'll be asking today as I inspect line by line the writing in some of Colleen Hoover's most notable stories. Welcome to Salted Latte, a place where I like to dissect prose through books and other mediums. I'd love it if you liked and subscribed as consolation for me voluntarily rage baiting myself with this video idea. Just a little disclaimer though, while I'm not reading the books we're going to be discussing here cover to cover, I have read approximately 1.5 Colleen Hoover stories. I couldn't get myself to finish It Ends With Us, I'm sorry. Generally, I know what I'm getting myself into here. I feel pretty confident that the issues that I'm going to point out in her prose today aren't just a fluke, but rather they are indicative of a larger trend. So the 3 novels that I'll be looking at are Verity, Slammed, and Woman Down. I felt like these 3 provided a good overview of Hoover's writing career and her evolution. Verity is one of her most popular works with the public. Slammed is her debut novel, and Woman Down is her most recent novel at the time of recording this, having come out earlier this year. So we'll get to see exactly how her prose has or hasn't changed in the over a decade since she's been writing professionally. And just to be clear, this isn't going to be 3 book reviews back to back. In fact, I'm hardly going to be focusing on the storylines at all, really. There's a lot of critiques to be made about the storylines that I feel like other people have said pretty well, but it's all about the craft of writing over here. What that means is that I read chunks of these books line by line, looking critically at aspects such as sentence structure and variation, the usage of punctuation, the effectiveness of line breaks, showing versus telling, usage of literary devices, the breadth of vocabulary, and more. To get to the bottom of why Colleen Hoover writes like she does, what this says about how she views her readers, and what this might say about how her readers view her. What I've found is frustrating as both a writer and as a reader, and I'm eager to share with you all and see what you think. So without further ado, let's dive in. Verity is about the main character, a struggling writer named Lowen, who bumps into some guy named Jeremy that happens to be the husband of a very famous author. He gets Lowen a job as a ghostwriter for his wife, and then presumably other things happen, but I wouldn't know because Amazon's free excerpt didn't let me get that far. And I was not going to be spending over $50 on all 3 of these books, but just trust me, okay? The reading samples gave me plenty of material to work with. After reading the opening line, quote, "I hear the crack of his skull before the spattering of blood reaches me," I was hopeful. Maybe the writing wasn't as terrible as I remembered. I was proven wrong. One of the main problems I ran into with the excerpt of Verity that I read had to do with the effectiveness of what little similes and metaphors she did choose to include in the book. As an example, she says, quote, "I closed my eyes before his head went under the tire, but I heard it pop like the cork of a champagne bottle." And she's using this to describe the main character witnessing someone get run over in the beginning scene. And to a casual reader, this line really isn't that offensive, but when we take a moment to pause and think about it, it does get a little confusing. For context, this scene is, from my perspective, intended to be quite dark and quite a gruesome opening to the novel, which I do generally enjoy. Why then would she choose to compare a man's head getting crushed with popping open of a bottle of champagne? Do you see what I mean? What is the meaning behind making this connection via metaphor? Champagne is a bubbly and celebratory drink. It just doesn't quite make sense with the tone that she is trying to establish. What could she have done instead to make the implementation of this literary device more cohesive with this tone, this darker tone? Maybe say something like, "But I heard it pop like a child science experiment gone wrong. But I heard it pop like the casing of a sausage." but I heard it pop and crunch like the smush of a bug between the sidewalk and a shoe. Those are just a couple examples I came up with on the spot that work to exemplify the grittiness and the discomfort that I think Colleen Hoover is trying to have in this beginning chapter, in these beginning first pages especially. You know, the meatiness of like sausage bursting out of a casing is much more in line with someone getting run over versus like popping open a bottle of champagne or any kind of sparkling drink. She also opens the second chapter with an ant metaphor that left me kind of confused as well. It reads, "The ant was alone, fluttering left and right, up and down, searching for food or friends. He seemed confused by his solitude, or maybe he was excited for his newfound freedom," which is fine, but then it's immediately followed with the next paragraph saying, "The fact that I was curious about the ant's current situation was a clear sign that I needed to leave my apartment. I was worried that after being cooped up, caring for my mother for so long, once I stepped out into the hallway, I would be just as confused as that ant." For context, in the first previous chapter, we learned that Lowen's mother, who she was caring for, had recently died of cancer. And leading up to her death, Lowen hadn't left the house in weeks. The first time I read this, I picked up on the fact that the ant was supposed to be a metaphor for Lowen and where her character is at, right when we as the readers first meet her. I'm not saying it's like a great metaphor or one that I personally would have chosen, but I picked up on the attempt and I was able to connect the dots before reading that other paragraph. So then why is that other paragraph there for Colleen Hoover to point blank tell us that the ant is supposed to represent the main character? What is the point of using metaphor if you are just going to say the thing that the metaphor represents? Especially when a few pages ago we just established that Lowen hadn't been leaving the house and she hadn't been social much lately. Do you really think your readers can't pick up on context clues like that? What kind of audience do you assume that you're writing for? Do you not trust your readers to pick up on context clues like that? As I was reading the first few chapters, that beginning scene where Lowen witnesses someone getting run over specifically, I couldn't help but notice a distance between myself and the story. I wasn't being pulled in the way that I expected to be. I believe it's mostly due to the way the accident was described, which we will get into that a little bit more momentarily. But oddly enough, I also think the first person point of view was also a reason why I felt detached as a reader. Those I, me, and my pronouns should make me feel more immersed, but there is a sterileness to the prose that feels odd given the darker subject matter. I have this theory that first-person POVs in books are becoming more and more popular because people think that it is an easier way to hook you into a story, but that is not always the case. Some authors end up relying too heavily on the first person to carry the reader through the story, and a lot of opportunities to actually tell the story and for developing meaningful prose ends up being ignored. Not all authors who write in first person do this, of course, but there is enough to where I've sort of caught on to that pattern. Let me know if you've ever noticed that too. But in Verity, for example, let's take a look at how Colleen Hoover writes about Lowen experiencing this guy getting run over. "I spin around to move away from the accident, to find a place to take a breath. But the crosswalk sign now says walk, and the thick crowd takes up heed, making it impossible for me to swim upstream in this Manhattan River. Some don't even look up from their cell phones as they pass right by the accident. I stop trying to move and wait for the crowd to thin. I glance back toward the accident, careful not to look directly at the man. The driver of the truck is now at the rear of the vehicle, wide-eyed and on a cell phone. 3, maybe 4 people are assisting them. A few are led by their morbid curiosities, filming the gruesome scene with their phones. There's a lot of repetitiveness of words like accident and phone here. In our real life internal monologues, we might repeat words or phrases to ourselves, but when we write, we aren't looking to capture reality exactly as it is in that kind of way. We are looking to capture the essence or the feelings that we are experiencing in those moments. There is an infinite amount of ways to convey that on paper character, and that is what makes a story interesting and impactful, and that's what makes a story different from just recounting a list of events. I don't want to read a character listing off their or other people's actions. I want to be enveloped in that action. I'm going to show you how I would rewrite this paragraph specifically to make the repetition serve this paragraph's greater function of conveying Lowen's trauma response to what she just witnessed against the everyday hustle of the city she inhabits, and in a way that feels less listified, I guess I could say, because Lowen is in this sort of freeze headspace while everything around her keeps moving, and I think instead of repeating accident or phone, it would make more sense to use a term to highlight that movement, something like forward maybe. I look for a place to pause, to take a breath, but the crosswalk sign lights up and a thick crowd moves forward, encasing me where I stand. They trickle by with one foot in front of the other, forward, forward, forward. Some don't even so much as glance up from their phones as they pass by the headless man. My gaze can't help but hover in his direction. This lack of care isn't isolated to Lowen's character either. It's apparent in how she writes Lowen describing Jeremy as well. Upon first meeting Jeremy, Lowen says this: "He's handsome, but there's something about him that makes me think he wishes he weren't. Almost as if his looks might be an inconvenience to him. A part of him he doesn't want anyone to notice. He wants to be invisible in the city. Just like me." This is the kind of note you as the author might write to yourself to help inform you as to how you want this character to come across to readers in the final version, which you then would transform and convey this information to readers through action and relevant detail. Then Lowen continues on saying that his eyes are chartreuse like his tie, which again just doesn't tell us anything about Jeremy. That's like one of the biggest story writing rules, show don't tell, and Colleen hardly adheres to it. And there is no way, just a side note, there's no way this guy actually has chartreuse colored eyes. Nobody does. A chartreuse? Like, stop trying to be quirky and just say green. It's okay if you just say green. Your two main characters meeting for the first time is a crucial part of your story in terms of setting up their dynamic. The way you as the author choose to write this interaction carries a lot of weight. And I am going to be annoying for a second and bring up an example from the book that I'm finishing up drafting to show you what I mean. Emphasis on draft, okay, it's not completed and I'm not claiming to be the best writer in the world. I never am with any of these videos. I'm just writing up examples and giving you examples for educational purposes, okay? But as I was reading this part of Verity, it did remind me of a scene that I wrote for my two main characters, Charlie and Clementine, and when they meet for the first time. Because it also happens under these sort of darker, grittier circumstances. And they're also both talking about eye color, but we're using that mentioning of eye color in different ways, so pay attention to that. It reads, "A voice from my left periphery cuts through my grounding attempt. I turn and look up, partly blinded by early summer sunshine smothering a teetered, disheveled figure. Blinking twice, I refocus my vision. A young man leans against the red brick exterior of the building I just escaped. As my eyes adjust, I make out dark wafts of hair in a lanky frame. Finally, my stare moves down his extended arm, a half-drunk clear plastic water bottle in hand. And then a few paragraphs down, Clementine continues describing Charlie, saying, 'Our eyes meet for the first time, and I gain a little more empathy for this awkward stranger and his clouded blue irises, like a deepening and turmoiled sky just before the release of rain. They appear like they have something more to say to me, and his lips do too. He parts them enough for me to notice before turning away to take another drink from his bottle.'" The difference between what I wrote and what Colleen Hoover wrote is that I didn't just say his eyes were blue. I used his eye color as an opportunity to characterize Charlie as someone who is brooding and a bit conflicted. He's holding something in that he can't quite figure out how to express, instead relying on other outlets to attempt to numb him, hence the bottle drinking. When Colleen says Jeremy is handsome and his eyes are green like his tie, that's it. That is all she means. There is nothing past the surface level here for the reader to catch on to and to contemplate. There could be, but instead she just hands you the answer on a silver platter by flat out writing, "He wants to be invisible in the city just like me." Before we move on to the next book, Slammed, I do want to show you a quick exercise you can do if you're a writer, or maybe just something to notice as you read to make your prose a little less repetitive and a little more engaging. This is something that I learned in my 10th grade English class, so it does also work for more academic papers too, not just books and stories. Let's pull up a couple of paragraphs from Verity, and we're going to highlight the first word of each sentence. He's already removed his suit jacket, which is now hanging from the doorknob. He frees himself of his button-up shirt, revealing a white undershirt beneath it. He's muscular, taller than me. His shirt will swallow me. I can't wear this to my meeting, but I have no other option. I take the shirt when he hands it to me. I grab a few more dry paper towels and pat them on my skin, then pull it on and begin buttoning it. It looks ridiculous, but at least it wasn't my skull that exploded on someone else's shirt. Silver lining. So as we can see, most of these sentences start with a pronoun, either he or I. He's removed his suit jacket, he frees himself, he's muscular, his shirt, I can't, I take, I grab, all back to back to back. And this can get stale and take readers out of the story. And this is another way you end up telling the reader instead of letting them experience that moment for themselves, which is why sentence variety is so important in terms of sentence structure and sentence length. We see a similar issue in literally the very next paragraph below this one, where most of the sentences start with I. I take my wet shirt out of the sink and accept there's no saving it. I toss it in the trash can, and then I grip the sink and stare at my reflection. I rub my cheeks with the heels of my hand to inspire color, to no avail. I look like death. So what can we do about this? And again, like I just mentioned, this is where sentence structure variation is helpful. We cannot avoid pronouns entirely, okay? That's not realistic. And that's also not necessary. But we can mix them in with other words, with other leading words or other leading actions to create a smoother flow. So let me show you how I reworked both of these paragraphs to be more engaging, simply by changing the beginning word. Hanging from the doorknob is his suit jacket. He frees himself of his button-up shirt, which could swallow me whole. I have no other choice but to wear this into my meeting. After patting a few more paper towels onto my skin, I pull it over my head, accepting how ridiculous I look. But at least it wasn't my skull that exploded. Silver lining. And then, there's no saving this wet shirt. I take it out of the sink to toss into the trash can. My reflection caught in the mirror is frightening. Two tired, empty eyes stare in a murky brown glaze. A pair of hollowed cheeks, colorless as death. Do you see the difference? Do you hear the difference in flow as I'm reading it? Okay, next up we've got Slammed, which is Colleen Hoover's very first novel. Slammed is about a teenager named Layken, spelled Layken. I don't know how she comes up with these names. But Layken moves across the country to Michigan with her mother and her younger brother after her father's unexpected death. There she meets her new neighbor Will, and I'm assuming by the end they fall in love. Again, didn't read the entire thing. One thing I'm coming to learn through making this video though is that Colleen Hoover loves to have two people fall in love under questionable circumstances. With Verity, the guy was married, and now in this story, Layken is technically 18, but she is still in high school, while Will is 21 and he is the sole provider for his little brother. So definitely suspicious, I think, but I guess nobody really cared back in 2012. Anyways, let's get into the prose. Something I noticed right off the bat with Slammed is the sheer volume of adverbs used in place of taking some time to develop literary devices like metaphor or any kind of descriptive language. In other words, just like Verity, she's telling instead of showing. In general, including adverbs in your writing, it's not bad and it doesn't always equate to lazy writing, but I am more cognizant of them in my personal usage when I'm writing or, when I'm reading other authors' writings, because I had a fiction writing professor in college who was very vocal about his distaste for adverbs, and he would point them out in our writing all the time. At the moment, that was kind of annoying, and he definitely did go overboard with it sometimes, but I do agree with the core point of what he was trying to make, which was that when you come across an adverb in your draft, it often points to other problems in that chunk of writing that need to be addressed, like weak verbs, for example, or redundancy, or just the need for more visual, refined description. So an example of a weak verb would be, I walked quickly into the house versus I hustled into the house. Or she was very pretty versus she was beautiful. Examples of redundancy would be I smiled joyfully versus I smiled, because, you know, when you're smiling, it's usually for like happy reasons. So you don't really need to necessarily emphasize that it was smiling joyfully. And then in lacking description, an example would be I smiled sadly versus I smiled in between sobs. So there are times when you smile when you're sad, but instead of just saying that you're sad, you could give your character an action which conveys the sadness in a way that is more interesting to read. So here's a quote that I pulled from the first chapter of Slammed, where Lakin is saying goodbye to her childhood home. It says, quote, I walk up the porch steps and head inside the house to make a walkthrough before the final turn of the key. All of the rooms are eerily empty. It doesn't seem as though I'm walking through the house where I've lived since the day I was born. In this short blurb, we kind of have problems with all three of these categories: weak verbs, redundancy, and lacking description. We have the repetition of the verb to walk 3 times in 3 sentences back to back. We also have the inclusion of the adverb eerily, which is doing a lot of legwork to support the verb are in that sentence. In fact, eerily seems to be doing most of the heavy lifting in this paragraph in order to provide any sort of description of this empty house and how the main character feels about it. So if I were to rewrite this to include stronger verbs, I would probably say something like, I climb up the porch and head inside the house for one final walkthrough. Each step I take echoes from empty room to empty room, like it had been abandoned for years and not center stage for my collection of childhood memories. So instead of repeating the verb walk 3 times and using the adverb eerily, instead we have verbs like climb and echoes and abandoned. And all of these verbs help to convey this like wistful, sad goodbye that Lakin is having this little moment, this last walkthrough in her house before it gets sold to someone else. A book that I've read recently and also did a book review on, so you can check that out if you want to, was Yesteryear by Carol Claire Burke. And it has a lot of household related descriptions that I really enjoy. And so I'm going to give you an example of one as a little bit of a comparison here. And it is a part where the main character Natalie is talking about her kitchen. She says, quote, another bonus of this area of the kitchen was that it was right next to a long row of windows. So the light, once the sun rose, was a perfect soft bright at any hour of the day. Just standing near that kitchen corner made me look and feel a good 6 years younger. God-given plastic surgery. This paragraph is more interesting to read than Colleen's, in my opinion, because it is purposeful. It connects back to how curated and how fake Natalie's life is online as the trad wife influencer she's kind of cosplaying. She refers to these windows in her kitchen as a bonus, like she is just so happened to be lucky enough to find a home that looked aesthetically pleasing for her social media career. But if you read the book, you know that Natalie was meticulous about renovating this house to be exactly like what she wanted, or rather exactly like what she thought others around her would want. Something else I noticed with Slammed in particular is what I like to call Wattpad writing. No disrespect to fanfiction writers, okay, Wattpad writing has its time and place, like on Wattpad and AO3 and other websites adjacent. Not necessarily in published books that people are paying for. And we can see what I mean when we look at how Lakin is describing her mother. She says, I look more like my mother than like him, her father. Mom and I are both of average height. After having 2 kids, she can't really fit into my jeans, but we're pretty good at sharing everything else. We both have brown hair that, depending on the weather, is either straight or wavy. Her eyes are a deeper emerald than mine, although it could be that the paleness of her skin just makes them more prominent. Like, what is this actually telling us about Lakin or her mother or their relationship to each other? Not much, aside aside from the very literal physical descriptions, again, another variation of his eyes are green like his tie. And also, why is Colleen Hoover obsessed with giving her characters unrealistically green eyes? First we have chartreuse and now we have emerald. Like, there are other colors eyes can be, Colleen, I promise. Including these kinds of visual descriptions, especially in this kind of info dumping way, makes the writing come off as rudimentary, almost like a fan fiction. If I remember correctly, taking a paragraph or two to talk about how the main character looked and what clothes they were wearing is sort of like a convention of fan fiction and that kind of genre, hence why I call this Wattpad writing. And this was Colleen's first book, which originally was self-published. She never really intended for it to go anywhere as far as I can tell, but I am surprised that there were no edits made once she did get picked up by a traditional publisher. Or at least I'm assuming there weren't edits made. I can't imagine what it looked like if this is what the end product is after edits. I can see what Colleen is trying to do here, which is to set up Laken's complicated relationship with her mother, basically saying, we might look similar on the outside, we might be able to share clothes, but we're nothing alike on the inside. It's just not integrated super well into the storyline. And maybe it gets better later. Again, like, I just read the first few chapters, but I have a feeling that it doesn't get better. I'm gonna go ahead and read you an excerpt of what I'm writing again because it fits in with the theme of what we're talking about here, which is child-parent dynamics. In my story, Charlie has a complex relationship with his father, and I also talk about appearances a little bit, but I use it to emphasize the disconnect that Charlie has with himself and with his body because of how similarly he looks to his father. The artificial illumination casts harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing certain features: aquiline nose, full lips, low cheekbones, furrowed brows. People say we look alike, and I've never taken those comments as compliments. I don't think my father is unattractive, far from it. When I was younger, for the longest time, I thought that artists modeled their Roman statues after him, but there's an ugliness within his blood-pumping vessel that most people never get close enough to see. I must face it every time I catch myself in the mirror, doing a double take with the hope of grounding myself in the only part of my face his genetics didn't overtake: my mother's oceanic deer in headlights eyes. When Laken talks about her mother, it's plopped into the middle of the first chapter after she finds an old hair clip and recounts a memory with her father, which I actually didn't mind, but that is what makes this description with the mother even more jarring to me, I think. It comes off the heels of this length of text that is a decent introduction to the main character's relationship with her father. Why not use that same level of effort with her mother? And of course, before we move on, there is even more redundancy in the story than the last one. About a page after Laken talks about her mom, she gives us this paragraph describing how her brother likes to be silly and do stuff out of order sometimes, in which she uses the word backwards about 1,000,000 times. And then immediately follows that up with this dialogue. Hurry to says Mom Laken, he says backwards. Does Colleen Hoover think her readers are stupid? Genuine question. Of course he's saying that backwards. He just finished telling us that he does that. Just unnecessarily redundant. And there is a similar issue here with, quote, our new landlord emailed us pictures of the house. I see an older man who I assume is our new landlord come outside and wave. My mother pulls in beside me in my Jeep and greets the landlord, all within the same page, all within a few paragraphs of each other. We get it. The landlord is here. Oh my god. Woman Down is Colleen Hoover's latest release. It's about an author named Petra who rents a cabin to work on her comeback novel after being the topic of an internet scandal about a year prior. The drama is centered around one of her previous books getting adapted into a movie. Sounds a little familiar? Just saying. The book opens with a couple of podcasters recapping, aka info dumping, about the main character Petra and how she got into this predicament of book to movie adaptation backlash. Maybe Colleen thinks because she's getting two random characters to tell us all this information and not Petra that it's better, but it's not. And it goes on for like 10 pages. 10 whole pages. Why would you choose to start off your story this way? To me, it just comes across as like a lazy way to provide backstory. We don't need to know all of this right at the start. Bits and pieces could have been interwoven through the first several chapters. And what value does having this backstory be told through a couple of snarky podcasters even bring, other than you probably wanting to take digs at people online like me who critique you in your writing, rightfully so? I feel like I'm getting a little crabby and cranky now. We're 3 books in and I can't. The story should have started almost 10 pages in when Petra turns off the podcast and has to pull over because hearing it is so nauseating. She says, "I turn off the podcast as soon as I hear his voice. My heart is pounding so hard and my stomach is churning. I have to pull my car over to the side of the road because I feel very close to puking." I mean, as a reader, let me know which opening paragraph better grabs your attention and draws you in. The original opening lines, which are, "Hey, Kelly here, your fiction therapist with a minor in messy behavior. Welcome back to And What Now, readers, the podcast where your favorite book drama gets lovingly dissected and lightly roasted." Or something like this. "Nausea comes in waves, becoming more intense each time. I have to pull this car over, now. My heart's pounding into my ears as I veer off the pavement, but it's not loud enough to drown out the shrill voices cackling through the radio. We used to quote her and now we just hate her," says one. Another pipes up. "True. We hate her so much that we've pulled some strings to book today's special guest. I thought I could do it. It's too much." I press the off button and sit in thick, uncomfortable silence. Here is another example of an opening page that I think is effective without revealing too much. It's from Bunny by Mona Awad, which I also did a book review on if you want to watch that too. "We call them bunnies because that's what they call each other. Seriously, Bunny. Example. Hi, Bunny. Hi, Bunny. What did you do last night, Bunny? I hung out with you, Bunny. Remember, Bunny? That's right, Bunny. You hung out with me and it was the best time I ever had. Bunny, I love you. I love you, Bunny." We don't know who they are yet, but we do know their pet name for each other, Bunny. And that image of a bunny alongside this example dialogue provided by the main character hints at a group mindset and this deep attachment that the bunnies have for one another. We don't understand why they are so connected, but we get this uneasy feeling reading these few lines due to the repetition of the nickname Bunny and the fact that one of these bunnies didn't even remember what they were doing last night. Why is that? What happened? This is much more effective than, "Hello, we're 2 random characters you're never gonna hear from again, and we're here to tell you all about the main character and the big problem she's having." We have some more instances of info dumping in the first chapter here with "I inhale a few slow breaths," attempting not to focus on the fact that Alistair is probably out there doing a tour of podcasts and interviews, and that I'm being forced to shut myself away in a grimy cabin and write a book I've been attempting to write since this whole movie fiasco started, just so I don't lose my house now that my sales have taken a nosedive. First of all, holy run-on sentence, I had to take many pauses for breaths there. And secondly, this information is relevant to Petra's character and the story, yes, but it doesn't need to be revealed all at once in the form of an excruciatingly long sentence. But moving on, we also have more issues with repetitive word choice, like what we saw with Verity, and also in Slammed as well. In Woman Down, the first couple of pages of chapter 2 are littered with neighbor and cabin specifically. I don't know that any part of my creativity will be salvageable if there are neighbors. I avoid booking places with neighbors, but there's a house on the same road as the cabin I'm staying in. I looked up satellite images for this place before I booked it just to make sure it's not near another cabin. The place where I'm staying looked to be secluded on this road, so I didn't notice the other cabin. The cabin I booked is tucked away at the end of the mile-long road I'm on. I prefer no traffic and no neighbors. I once booked a writing retreat and met the neighbors before I even made it to the front door. I found all of these instances within 4 2 to 3 sentence paragraphs, most happening back to back. Between 12 sentences, yes, I counted, neighbors and or cabin show up 8 times. That is too many times. When I point out repetition, it's not because using a word multiple times is bad. In fact, repetition, when done well and with purpose, can be a wonderful tool for characterization, scene description, and to draw a reader's attention to the subtext of your story. The bunny example I just brought up uses the word bunny 10 out of the 11 sentences, but the difference is that it's done effectively and intentionally, and not because Mona Awad just didn't feel like taking 30 seconds to think of another way to refer to the bunnies. It unifies this group of women in an infantilized, cult-like way, which is an important through line of the story. Both of these issues were apparent in all three of the books that I took a look at for this video, but I wanted to point them out again in Woman Down because this is her latest release. It came out this year, 2026. After over a decade of writing and over 20 published books, you'd think she would have improved from her first one, Slammed, all the way back in 2012. But she hasn't. Not all of her prose is bad. There is a part in chapter 2 where Petra describes the host of the cabin she's renting that I didn't mind. She says, quote, "The man's grin stretches and I half expect his face to split open as if it can't quite contain all of his teeth. There's a bounce in his step that reminds me of someone who's far too eager to please, as if he's trying to sell me on this booking that I paid for months ago." But what precedes that is this odd internal monologue Petra has about corgis that has literally nothing to do with anything. All of these years and nearly nothing has changed. Why? There could be many reasons, including prioritizing palatability as a marketing strategy, the shortening of attention spans, discourse surrounding the average person's reading skill and comprehension level, the commodification and aestheticization of reading due in part to the rise of communities like Book Talk, the fact that Colleen pumps out a book nearly every single year, leaving less time for edits and revisions, and I do think all of those play a role in Colleen Hoover's writing style and structure. But I also think the answer is much clearer than that at its core. Colleen writes like this because she doesn't have to write any better, because what caught a publisher's attention over a decade ago is still enough to land her on bestsellers lists today, because her readers don't demand more from her, and perhaps most notably, Colleen Hoover doesn't demand more from her readers. Everybody's comfortable, just comfortable enough to be complacent. I talked about this a little bit in my video about the problem with Book Talk authors, but I want to bring it up here again because I think it's also relevant. A big issue I have with book review influencers becoming authors is that they are good readers, but they're not well versed in writing. And the luck of the algorithm can present them with opportunities in writing and publishing before they're actually prepared to take them on with care. I wonder if a similar phenomenon has happened with Colleen Hoover. In preparation for this video, I read through her Wikipedia page and her website. They both mention how many books she's written and all of her accolades, her fan base on TikTok, and her film adaptations. Neither of them talk about her love for writing or even reading. There's no mention of when her interest in writing began, who her influences are, or really anything related to her personal connection to writing. All of this combined with the writing style that we've just spent how many minutes discussing leaves me questioning if Colleen Hoover actually does have a passion for prose, or if she just saw an opportunity to build a more lucrative career doing easier work and ran with it. And when I say easier work, like, I do recognize writing is hard work. It takes time. It can make you want to pull your hair out sometimes, but Colleen was a social worker before this, and that's just like on a whole other level of really tough public-facing jobs that just aren't valued enough in our society. The only mentions of writing before fame are that she got inspired from a song lyric, self-published her first novel Slammed so that her family could read it, got lucky with a couple of good reviews, and that's how this all started. I'm not saying that Colleen needed to have gotten a bunch of degrees or spent her whole life dedicated to writing to prove herself or anything, but this does very much feel like a whoops, I guess I'm an author now kind of situation. What I'm trying to get at is this: there's no story here about why Colleen Hoover writes stories, and even without knowing anything about her background, I think you can tell that just from her prose. It is rudimentary, and I don't have an issue with simplistic styles of writing when it is done with purpose. Like with The Hunger Games, for example. That dystopian kind of world makes sense written with simpler and straightforward prose and not like lengthy flowery prose. Simple doesn't always equal bad, just like complex doesn't always equal good. I think I see a lot of people gloss over or excuse Colleen's prose because of the kinds of books she writes. Even though she markets them as these kind of darker romances, a lot of people talk about them as if they are a light beach read. And the general public's romanticization of her books is a whole other topic. But I'm bringing it up here because people pick a book like It Ends With Us off the shelves since it's grouped into that romance category, and so there's this underlying expectation that the book will be quote unquote easy. And of course that stereotype is fueled by a lot of things, most notably the romance genre historically being dominated by female readers, and how misogyny devalues any subject or craft that has a large female audience. Because of this, whether we realize it or not, many of us hold lower standards for these types of books and for the authors who write them. Stories can be simple without being easy, and I don't think these two terms should be synonymous. A simple story can and should be written well. The stories deserve it. The readers deserve it. And I'll bring up The Hunger Games again because I think it's a great example. It's a book that falls under the young adult fiction category, which spans from ages 12 to 18. The prose that Suzanne Collins uses is accessible to middle schoolers, and yet it still carries enough impact that adults connect with it and find meaning from the series too. The words are simple, yes, but they are crafted with intention. And that is what distinguishes a story that might make you some money short term from a story that has acclaim for generations. I'd love it if you liked and subscribed to the channel. Like I said at the beginning of this video, over here at Salted Latte, I love to dive into and dissect prose through mostly books, but really all sorts of mediums, anything I'm interested in at the moment. And let me know what you think about Colleen Hoover and her writing style. Have you read any of her books before? Were the examples I gave helpful? Was this enlightening, educational at all, entertaining at all? I always enjoy writing the examples up. It's like a nice little stretch for my brain. I think it's fun. But that is all I have to say for now. I will talk to you all soon. Goodbye.